My marriage to Jennings opened up a whole world of fulfillment that I never knew existed. I loved when he moved next to me, pressing his body against the small of my back. Just the warmth of him. Even the smell of him was intoxicating and wonderful when he bent over to kiss the small of my neck. Because I had a career and got married later than my friends, it was later than they in life that I knew the joys of intimacy, and my husband had always been the gentlest of teachers. I walked with caution for the first few weeks together, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I couldn't believe my happiness. It took me a while to trust not only Jennings, but to trust my belief in my own choices. By now, one would think I would be getting it right. So if Jennings was willing to put forth the effort, I was also willing to try to make it right. As it was, it seemed to be working for us. I became more confident that everything would be in place as it was at that moment. He and I started going to Sunday services at our local Presbyterian church. He joined the community baseball team, and I continued with my career. For the first time since my marriage, I started to think that maybe I wouldn't have to worry about tomorrow. I accepted an anchor position at a local CBS affiliate and took off my romper room hat. My staff at work used to kid me that my biggest fan club was behind bars. Inmates doing time may have a lot of it on their hands. Television is the strongest link to the outside world when in prison, and I was there to entertain them and fulfill their fantasies. But I was always accessible to my viewers. I felt I owed it to them. After all, it was their loyalty that paid my bills. One afternoon after my talk show, a call was put through to my office. "Hey, kid, I really love your show," the man continued in his graveled voice. "Why don't you meet me in the parking lot behind the firehouse? I'm a big fan of yours. I'll show you just how big I am." For once, I was speechless. I quickly hung up the phone in disgust. Now, if that first call had been the last, I was repulsed, but I wouldn't have thought much about it and written it off as a prank. But that call was to be just the beginning of numerous calls this man made to the station. Then, as if that wasn't enough, letters started arriving in my mail. Letters declaring undying love for me. Really scary letters that were obviously written by a very deranged person. Appearances I had to make in conjunction with my job had to be honored, so I began going to them with either my husband or my director as bodyguards. I was always cautious about being in public alone. I made sure of my surroundings and pre-planned my travel agenda while at those events. To this point in my life, challenges became the norm, but this time I was facing one that could affect my safety. Oh, how many days I wished it was just a bad nightmare and that I would wake up in the morning with reality releasing me. But the reality was the truth that someone was after me, and I could not shake the constant fear I had for my personal safety. The timing for this new crisis was less than perfect. It was deer hunting season. My husband grew up in a family of hunters, and that year Jennings and his brother rented a cabin in the Allegheny Mountains for weekend hunting during the season. There was no phone at the cabin, so I was unable to reach him, and he was there unless he called me. I had no lifeline, basically an emergency. I was on my own. I never really understood hunting. I hated guns. I never liked the concept of killing defenseless animals for sport. But in Pennsylvania, where my husband was raised, it was taken for granted that hunting was a part of manhood, and it was a skill that was learned early by the young boys. Fathers and sons bonded in the snowy fields during deer season. I especially remember that we spent one Thanksgiving at his parents' farm in western Pennsylvania. It had been a beautiful winter week, and the hills around the farm were covered with a blanket of crystal snow. Looking out the window, the pine trees beyond the clearing at the edge of the hills reminded me of green gumdrops plopped on white icing, randomly placed on the rolling hills. That year, we had so much to be thankful for, and we stuffed ourselves with the bountiful foods that were prepared by his mother. Afterwards, we gathered by the fire for dessert and warm homemade apple pie, the aphrodisiac of the foods we had eaten still lingering about us. "Thar he goes! I saw 5 points on them antlers," his father shouted, as he and the other men leapt from their chairs, and they were off, coats and hats flying in the air as they reached for the guns outside the kitchen door. The hunt was on. Out of curiosity, I got up and looked out the front window. The men were scattering all over the hillside, leaving trails behind them in the snow, and then disappeared into the trees at the top of the hill. I looked, straining to see, but the hillside was empty. Good, I thought. Maybe he got away. Then a sharp crack, then another, and then another in rapid succession. Crack, 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 echoing against the hills. The house became so quiet, it was as if everybody in the room was taken down by those bullets. The women, the children. For a moment, there was stillness of death inside that house. I'll never forget the eerie feeling of it. Transfixed at the window, I finally saw Jennings and his father drag the animal into the clearing. My husband had been the victor. I could see his father patting him on the back as if to say, "Well done, son." Jennings bent over the animal, and I watched as warm vapor rose into the air above the men's heads. Then a trail of red, fanning out, spilling onto the virgin snow. I had to turn away from the window and walk to where the children were playing quietly on the floor. I scooped my son up in my arms and beckoned for my daughters to come to me, and I held them close. I was beginning to realize that we sometimes love without knowing or understanding why. My husband and I had come from very different worlds, but I truly loved him in spite of our differences. It was hard for me to concentrate on my work with a demented fan out there somewhere that I knew could hurt me at any time. The pleasure I had getting up each morning and going to work that never seemed like work because I enjoyed it so, was slowly ending, being replaced by a dreadful, ominous sinking feeling in my stomach every single morning. Because of my situation, I was nervous about going out alone. This complicated my ability to meet the children's needs for the activities on the weekends, so I tried to schedule outings with them in very public places. During Jennings's absence, I often took them skating at the indoor rink in town. It was a popular gathering place for most of the friends, and I knew a few of the mothers who would be there, so it was also an outing for me. One Saturday in mid-January, we decided to spend the morning at the rink. It took a half an hour looking for lost mittens and matching boots. Skate sizes were sorted and tied together, and finally we were off to the rink where the bundling process would be reversed, pulling and lacing 3 pairs of skates, undoing the lumps in the socks, laces too tight, laces too loose, ankles bending, others too tight, Well, whatever the margin of error was, I had to fix it before they went onto the ice. Already so spent before the morning had begun, I would run toward the snack bar and get my morning fix of caffeine, take my place on the benches around the rink with the other worn-out, dutiful mothers, and proudly watch my offspring giggle, glide, and stumble around the rink. Sitting there, I realized how lucky I was and how much I loved my children. They were too young to appreciate it, but I would walk the ends of the earth for them if I had to. After the skating period was over, one by one they reluctantly returned to the bench where I was sitting, and the bundling process began all over again. After a bit of cranking and groaning, we walked out into a light dusting of snow. The children squealed as they practiced their snow sliding techniques on the slippery surface beneath their feet, and I was grateful just to keep upright until I reached the car. I quickly unlocked the doors and they piled in, one on top of the other, pushing and playfully shoving to their seats. As I walked around to unlock my side, I realized my front left tire looked rather flat. Then I checked the back left tire to compare, and it was completely flat. What luck, I thought as I went around to the passenger side of the car. They were all flat. I bent down to inspect them more closely and then had to convince myself that, yes, all 4 of my tires had been slashed. Who would be sick enough to do this to me? The haunting reality of my demented admirer came into focus. I immediately took the children back to the warmth and safety of the rink and called the garage to come and bring replacement tires with them. I bought them hot dogs and hot chocolate and tried to control my anger. The longer I sat there waiting for the truck, the greater my frustration and isolation became in not being able to contact my husband. "Well, we're going to have to tow you to the garage, ma'am," the driver said. "What for? I mean, can't you just change the tires here?" I questioned. "It's not that easy. All the bolts have been tightened and stripped. All of them." That meant towing the car to the garage with all of us piled in beside him in the front seat. All 4 of us, plus the driver. The young man quickly attempted to clean the grimy seat of its litter, and the children and I squeezed into the cab of the truck. We huddled for the next 2 hours waiting our turn in the cold garage that smelled of automobile fluids and bologna and onion sandwiches while they worked on my car. Woe is me country music was playing from the radio, and the reality of what was happening to me was slowly sinking in. Maybe it was an act of random vandalism, but I strongly suspected that the gravel-voiced man had targeted me for either aggravation or extinction. Now I knew that I was not even safe in public places, and worst of all, the safety of my children had been jeopardized. I wanted my husband. I needed him around me and not so far away. More than ever, I couldn't be left alone. Somehow, I knew we had to restructure our lives so that we could find this man who was terrorizing me. Jennings arrived home just before sunset that night, and after the children were in bed, I related what had happened to us at the skating rink. His face was intent, marking my every word as I went through the details of the incident. I could barely get the story out, and the lump in my throat constricted my words as I choked back tears. He held me tightly in his arms. "I'm here now. I won't let that guy hurt you. Nothing's going to happen to you as long as I'm around. Look at me. You have my word." And I believe with all of my heart that he would protect me. My husband was truly a dichotomy in the history of our relationship, at times so loving, at others so emotionally removed. I wanted to believe him as my protector. I had no one else. I needed to trust his judgment when he said we shouldn't go to the police with our suspicions, that would generate unwanted publicity and encourage the stalker to be more aggressive. He assured me that he wouldn't go hunting on weekends anymore and would spend his time at home with us. I had to depend upon him, my only ally against my enemy. Over the next few weeks, Jennings kept his promise and stayed home on weekends, and I tried not to spend as much as time at work by doing some of my research at home. After a few weeks, I kind of began to relax and almost convinced myself that the tire incident had been a random act of violence by some teenager, but the calm didn't last long. As was my habit, I had driven to the station early in the morning to prepare for my afternoon show. Usually, I would be on my way home after finishing the 6 o'clock news, but that day I was taping a late interview with Pierre Salinger, who had young Teddy Kennedy in tow. Mr. Salinger and his entourage were running a little late, so by the time I wrapped that evening, it was close to 10 o'clock. My producer walked me to my car and waited until I pulled out of the parking lot. I reached over and turned on the heat and then clicked on the radio as I wound down the hill from the station and onto the main road, heading south. I was feeling tired but rather elated at what I felt was a good interview. I was running through my head the editing I would do tomorrow on the piece. Intellectually, Mr. Salinger was an interesting subject, but what his future might hold I didn't know when I thought about the younger Kennedy. Certainly, the Kennedy name had power connected to it, but other than good looks, I couldn't get much substance in off-camera chats with Ted Kennedy. I personally didn't feel that he had the same dynamics as his older brother John had, but I was convinced that his handsome face he probably would get elected if he ran for office, just on looks alone. Others with lesser connections have won elections, and with the Kennedy name and his looks, he would have probably very few challenges. Then, of course, my mind became preoccupied with the thoughts about Ted Kennedy and the Chappaquiddick accident, where Mary Jo drowned and Ted allegedly swam away. Supposedly he left her there, imprisoned in the car he had driven into the water. Then all of a sudden an unusual smell caught my attention. What is it? Oh, it's just the heater, I guessed. As I continued driving, the odor, a chemical smell of some sort, became stronger. I turned off the heater. Then I glanced at my dashboard to see if any warning lights were on, and I noticed that the cigarette lighter was pushed in. I don't smoke, and I've really never used it. How did that happen? I wondered. I've never used the darn thing. I reached over and tried to disengage the lighter, but I couldn't. It appeared to be stuck. I pulled harder to no avail, still keeping my eyes on the road. I touched the top of the dashboard above the lighter, and it felt hot. I wasn't sure how hot the dash would have to get to combust, but I didn't want to take any chances. Just ahead, I saw an exit sign on a dark freeway. I had to think about that. Well, there was a chance that there would be a service station nearby where I could get help. I pressed on the accelerator to reach the exit faster. For once, I wished that there was a state trooper around as I hit 85 miles per hour on my speedometer. 5 miles seemed like 20. I slowed down as I neared the exit and carefully managed a sharp turn off the freeway into the country road. Boy, it was dark. Nothing was in sight. Left, or should I turn right? No signs anywhere. I flipped a coin in my head and turned left and prayed it was the right decision. I rolled down the window a little bit, just enough to keep out the cold, yet to release the noxious odor of smoldering wire. My eyes searched the darkness for some sign of life somewhere. Then I saw lights of a town in the distance, and on the edge of the land, a high Texaco sign beamed down at me. By now the smell of burning was beginning to make me nauseous, and I rolled the window all the way down. I screeched into the station and almost knocked over the cans of oil stacked neatly by the pumps as I pulled up near the garage doors. "Hey, lady, what's your hurry?" the attendant yelled angrily, ready to let me have all of the expletives in his vocabulary. I jumped out of the car that was by this time starting to smoke. "Holy shoot! Your car's smoking! You'll blow this whole damn station up! Get out of the way!" he hollered as he pushed me aside and ran toward the station. In 2 seconds he was back with a fire extinguisher. I stood there shaking as he sprayed under the hood with a white chemical foam. Someone else came running with a large hammer ready to bash in my dash, but the attendant had it under the control. And it was over. I got back into the car, locked the doors, and drove away in a daze. Now I could no longer dismiss the acts of violence. They were not accidental or random. The next time, maybe it just wouldn't involve my car. It just might involve me. Or even more horrendous, my children. I went to bed that night in the comfort of my husband's arms, replaying the day's events over and over again to him and in my head. The fear would not go away, and sleep was impossible. I didn't know how I could face another day at work knowing my hunter was out there watching my every move. Who knew how vigilant this demented person would continue to be in his campaign to do me bodily harm? Jennings instilled into my head that we should keep these incidences as quiet as possible and work through private channels to find my stalker. He knew a retired detective, he said, he could go to and could take it on. Jennings assured me that if he couldn't help us, then we would go to the police. Just leave it to him, he said. My husband's contact started on the case immediately. He had little to go on except for the details of the events leading up to the car fire. He would investigate and search every angle for someone in the area with a background that could match the behavior of my stalker. From my investigative work as a reporter, I knew he would have access to information that would encompass files and other sources within the prison system. I highly suspected that my stalker was a fan from prison that was now on the streets. In the meantime, I went about my work trying to act as normally as possible, when in truth I was living in a constant state of fear that all but paralyzed me. The strain also seemed to be taking a toll on my husband. Somewhere deep within me I knew I was being selfish to continue to draw my family into this precarious situation, all because I worked in the public eye. How many times, I asked myself, was it all worth it? Within weeks, I had my answer. One morning, before we would leave the house, Jennings discovered that the wires in my car battery had been crossed. A chill ran through me. I was not safe anywhere, anytime, anymore, not even in my own home. My enemy, who was determined to love me to death, would not stop until his goal was completed. And in the process, my family could be harmed as well. The reality of what was happening to me was never clearer, nor my choice of what had to be done more definite. The next morning, I handed in my notice from the job that was so fulfilling for me, that so many would have given their eye teeth to have. But now, as far as I was concerned, nothing else mattered. My dream career had to end. Whatever life my husband and I had built, we would have to leave it behind and find a haven far away from public life and the violence that was inevitable for me if I continued with my career. I didn't see that I had any other choice.
Had you been watching and waiting from some place up above, somehow knowing in this place, all these people, I'll find love. And I cannot wait to get to know you, to help you ease the troubles on your mind.